No, you can.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I want to begin just by updating you on a case that some of you may have seen that resolved last week. Here in Belmont, Dean Capsalis, a 56-year-old man, was convicted in a case that had happened in January in 2021. And just an awful case. And not that every murder isn't needless and senseless, but this one was particularly senseless. 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a residential street here in Belmont, there was an argument between two men over a turn signal and whether a turn signal should have been used or shouldn't have been used. The two of them got out of their cars, some shouting back and forth, and then it seemed to be over. And as the two of them were heading back to their cars, Mr. Capsalis hurled a really hateful insult at 36-year-old Mr. Tapia. And when Mr. Tapia turned around, having heard what he said to him, Capsalis then got in his truck and drove his pickup truck at him, hitting him and killing him. He was convicted last week of second-degree murder, violation of constitutional rights causing serious bodily injury, assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon in the car, and leaving the scene because he fled before turning himself in later to the police. This was by far, in terms of consequences, the worst hate crime we've prosecuted here. We owe a great debt to our law enforcement partners and to the attorneys and staff who worked on this case, an incredible amount of work over the last 2 years to put that case together. And I think what's really significant about this is it illustrates my view here in Middlesex County that when things happen that are motivated by hatred or racism, we are not going to treat that just as a background fact. We are actually going to call things what they are. This was a motor vehicle homicide, but it was a motor vehicle homicide motivated by hatred and racism. And I think that's really important that we charge that separately. You know, in some ways, in terms of sentencing, because he was convicted of second-degree murder, the penalty is an automatic life sentence with the possibility of parole at whatever number the judge sets it at, beginning at 20 years. So that sentence is much more substantial than the sentence for the hate crime, obviously. But I think it's important that we call them what they are, we charge them that way, and that is a separate offense and conviction. And one of the things that it relates to our topic today is we owe an incredible debt to the neighbors on that street who both made observations about what happened, who ran out and were with Mr. Tapia as he lay there, terribly injured, in the time it took for the first responders to get there and provide help for him. We would probably not have known really what happened out there had those people not been willing to come forward. And that's a hard thing to do. One of the individuals, having just seen what happened, and you can imagine yourself the shock at seeing somebody actually take a car and run over a human being, then ran after the truck in order to get the license plate. People just really showed their best side, incredible grace and courage. And then to be asked to come in and testify, that is a difficult thing to do. And people came forward and did that. And obviously, you know, nothing we can do in court brings Mr. Tapia back to his partner, to his 3 little kids. But it does hopefully send that signal that we are going to hold people fully accountable in those instances. And similarly to that idea of the folks who came forward and who were willing to testify, today we're going to talk about what has to be one of the most difficult decisions that a parent or a family member ever has to make when they are confronted by really scary or unlawful behavior by somebody they love, making that decision to call law enforcement. And again, I always think all of us have people that we care about. And and in many cases, younger people that we care about. And if you became aware of something that you found threatening, scary, extremist behavior, could you make that decision? Would you make that decision to call law enforcement and talk about that? And, we know that things like hate crimes is similar to sexual assault cases, are cases that people are afraid to report, in part because everybody has some apprehension about going to the police, but also because the victims in those cases feel that they won't be heard, they won't be believed. And we have worked very hard over the years with our law enforcement partners to try to break down those barriers. It's come in the form of having specialized units, whether it's for children or sexual assault victims, or the emphasis we put here on hate crimes, really having people who've been doing it so they recognize it, they know what it is when people are talking about it. And we really want to normalize the reporting of those crimes. That's why we've used the forms. We're talking to everybody in communities. Please just tell us about it. And also working with our legislative partners around increasing penalties for some of these kinds of crimes. And we all know, there's no question that I'm often doing it, other law enforcement agencies are often doing it, going to the public and asking for their help about investigations. Tip lines, monetary rewards, press releases, Amber Alerts, Silver Alerts. We do that all the time, asking people to be on the lookout, whether it's for somebody who's missing, for a suspect, or for somebody who may have seen something. Just recently, it was a tip to the FBI tip line that led authorities to the suspect in the massacre of the family in Cleveland, Texas. So somebody came forward to do that. And interestingly, over 100,000 tips came into the FBI from people in this country who turned in friends or family for their involvement in the Capitol riots. And several of those tips resulted in at least one high-profile arrest. Last week, 4 members of the Proud Boys were convicted of seditious conspiracy in Washington for their involvement in that rally, their attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And I think that really marked a big shift. As terrible as that event was, you would hope that people really saw where we were going and that we had to step up and make those calls. And, I think we all have the Thanksgiving dinner where somebody in our family is very estranged from us in terms of their politics. And I think certainly around the January 6th incident, people's sense of moral obligation, and in many cases, I think fear of what somebody might do next, really motivated them to report that. And, we know in every place that you see that extremism has increased. It certainly did during the Trump era, during the pandemic lockdown. More people were locked up at home. It was easier to be online and go down those crazy rabbit holes. That has certainly had a part in the increase we've seen in the hate and bias incidents. In Massachusetts, where we think we are so blue and so safe, last year we had one of the highest levels of white supremacist activity reported, including the distribution of racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-LGBTQ plus flyers and other propaganda. We were, and I think you have to really think about this, we were second to Texas. That is not a place you want to be in terms of the number of those incidents that happened here. And so we're going to really talk today about what we can be doing in our communities, in our homes, to address the behavior of those individuals who might act on the way they become radicalized with extremist beliefs. And we're going to talk about a national nonprofit that is a resource for families and parents. And of course, anybody we have seen can be vulnerable to this kind of radicalization, but we do know that kids are increasingly at risk. As they mature and become independent, they're taking risks, they're pushing boundaries in so many areas. They're searching to answers for questions about their identity, about their faith, about belonging, and sometimes looking for a little adventure and excitement. And I think that makes it so much easier for extremist groups to take advantage of that. And the organization we're going to be talking about today, Parents for Peace, is a nonprofit alliance of families to raise awareness, support families that are grappling with radicalization, and help to protect young Americans. And I'm really happy today to have Diana Hughes here with us. Diana is a native of Boston, and she is the Senior Director of Strategy and Operations at Parents for Peace. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree in international relations from BU's Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies. She also studied psychology and graduated from the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Psychoanalysis Postgraduate Fellowship Program. And her academic research has been mainly focused on the psychology of violent extremism and terrorism. Before she joined the Parents for Peace team, Diana worked for the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, Emergency Preparedness, Research, Evaluation, and Practice team, continuing to their research around terrorism, extremism, and human trafficking. She's written several publications on these topics. That was a lot of a mouthful, but Diana, we're really happy to hear you today. We're going to put out in the chat, if we haven't already, the Globe article that Kay Lazar did recently about Parents for Peace. But welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. That was a great introduction. I actually have an introduction slide, so I can kind of go right through that. I can also, after the presentation, we were also picked up in a Vogue article yesterday that I just saw, talking more about, instead of more of the radicalization to violent extremist ideologies, but also conspiracy theories, which I can touch upon a little bit today, as you might see a lot of that in your cases as well. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Also, before I start, I love questions. So if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. I'll leave time for questions at the end as well. But I find sometimes I'm like, oh, I had a question and I forgot it. So if you want to throw that in, and if I happen to see it, I can answer it either at the time if I see it or at the end. So I will start now. Let's see. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Deanna Hughes. I'm the Senior Director of Strategy and Operations at Parents for Peace. Here is kind of, again, more of my introduction, just saying I focus on the psychology of violent and nonviolent extremism, risk assessment tools, and evaluation, and program evaluation. So what is Parents for Peace? So Parents for Peace was founded in 2015 by Melvin Bledsoe and Monica Hawley. So I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here. Oh, maybe not. But basically in the picture below, we have both Monica and Melvin. And Monica, so Melvin had a son, Carlos, which is Monica's brother, and he converted to Islam, ended up studying in the Middle East, and became incredibly devout in a very extreme form of Islam. And he ended up executing a terrorist attack in Arkansas, where he murdered an officer at a military recruitment facility. So Melvin and Monica got together as a father and brother of this individual and said, who do we talk to about this? There's so much shame. There's so much, guilt. What could they have done? And they've tried to find other families in this situation. And then they founded Parents for Peace. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit empowering intimate bystanders, which are families, friends, and communities, to prevent, manage radicalization, violence, and extremism. So that's a big mission there. But as we go through, I'll kind of break it down for you. So our team. So this is, we've had a lot of intros to the team, including me in January. So I'm not quite in this picture yet, but I know I will be soon. So our team. So we have exit interventionists. So these are people who are not, we don't provide therapy, but these people have a psychological background. And they are running the interventions, which is coaching families and giving them some guidance. So I'll get into more of this a little bit later, but coaching could be talking to a parent saying, well, your child lives with you and you have the Wi-Fi password. So if they're getting on extremist websites, what if you change the Wi-Fi password or only allow them on Wi-Fi at certain times of day? So how can we help the parents set limits and kind of connect with their children again? We also have exit peer specialists, and these are people who are former extremists that have lived recovery experiences. So in the picture, the two people on the right, The one on the very far right is Chris Buckley. So Chris Buckley is one of our exit peer specialists. He was in the military. He went to Afghanistan, and on return, he had, a lot of trauma from seeing friends die. His vehicle he was driving flipped, and he had a pretty severe back injury that led to an opioid addiction. So he came back with pretty significant PTSD and an opioid addiction, and he joined and rose rather quickly through the KKK. So now he works with us to help pull people out of white nationalist ideologies. And the person to his left, Mubin Sheikh, he is from Canada, and he was part of an Islamist movement prior to 9/11. So he always tells me that people say everything I learned about Islam, I learned on 9/11. And he said everything I learned Islam was not, I learned on 9/11. So he had actually started planning an attack on a Jewish house of worship prior to that. And then after 9/11 started pulling away from the group and worked with the Canadian equivalent of the CIA to put other people in prison. And he actually visited the Jewish house of worship that he was going to originally bomb. And he's really good friends with the rabbi there now, which is a very interesting kind of turn of events for all of us. We also have researchers. So in the middle, we have our former program director, and I'm also more on the research team as well. And then the two people on the left here, this is Pardeep Kalika, whose father was killed in a white nationalist terrorist attack, who also is one of our exit interventionists, as well as our executive director, Miriam Churchill. We also have a load of interns who are absolutely amazing. So if you have any other interns you'd love to send me, let me know. We're always looking for more help. So outline. So I'm going to kind of go quickly through some of this just to be mindful of your time, but I'm also always down to have more conversations like this. So to talk about what we're going to talk about today, what does the radicalization pathway look like? Where does Parents for Peace fit in? And how can we work together to create a whole society approach to combating radicalization, violence, and extremism with some case studies? So what does the path of radicalization look like? A lot of it surrounds an identity crisis, environmental factors, and extremist recruitment. So going through this, so identity crisis. I'm sure in COVID and also in growing up in general, we've all had maybe more than one identity crisis, but it's major disruption to your sense of self, especially when we're talking about teenagers. I think back to my teenage years where your hormones are raging and you're trying to figure everything out and everything seems so stressful. And it really is when you're that age. And a lot of that leads a lot of students to, or just people in general, to want clarity, right? I want to know a yes or a no. I want to know what I should be doing and when I should be doing it. And extremism allows for a numbing and a sense of belonging. So I don't have to worry about what I should or shouldn't be doing, because this group is going to tell me what I should or shouldn't be doing. They're going to tell me what's cool and what's not cool, what's right and what's not right, who to love and who to hate. It takes out all the emotional guesswork out of it. Now, with, as I said, we've all had identity crises. I don't think everyone on this call is necessarily an extremist. So there are some things that make people a little bit more vulnerable to extremism, including like unhealed trauma, addiction, mental health and neurological problems, as we've seen, isolation, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, and environmental factors. So we talk a lot about this, and this is the environment, meaning an individual's friends, sometimes family, whether it's the victimhood mindset of being like, I'm always under attack, everything's happening to me, scapegoating. We typically blame others for issues, right? So it's like, oh, well, I can't find a job because of immigration from X place, and I've never met anyone from there. And, it's so much easier to kind of push that. Covering up potential abuse. There's also a failure to set healthy boundaries. This is a big one especially for students. So teens' minds unconsciously crave safe guidance. So if you're not going to provide, if parents and communities and friends are not going to provide that safe guidance, they might look online to find that. And then social media. I'm personally, I can admit now that I'm addicted to Instagram, and I'm working on it. I set my limits to that. So if anyone else is like me, we can totally understand kind of the social media rewards, likes, and attention. And especially when you're younger, it's the anxiety over recognition. When people like my posts, will they, think I'm cool from this? And it's that kind of seeking. And that can easily become, as we've seen, rather addictive. So you take all of that kind of individual factors and the environmental factors, and then we have extremist recruitment. So there are people online and in person that are willing to take these people and have them fight for a cause. They can provide community, identity, and purpose, which are huge, huge components of what we need for human connection. And they psychologically manipulate personal injuries and insecurities, and they target and condition their new recruits. So when I was just talking about Chris Buckley, who I mentioned rose quickly through the KKK, we were talking and someone asked, like, how were you recruited into this? And he was like, well, I got back from Afghanistan and I couldn't find a job. I had a wife and 2 kids. And I, had an addiction problem. And the KKK invited me to a barbecue and gave me money to pay for my kids' school clothes. So they're not starting out with this horrific rhetoric. They're starting out with that community identity and purpose. And when you kind of think about it like that, you're like, oh, okay, like if I were in that spot and saw these people caring about me and telling me there was nothing wrong with me, you can totally understand why this could be alluring to people. I'm quickly going to just mention, it also benefits the people recruiting. So they sometimes get monthly dues. Some leaders of the KKK have, use these monthly dues and cuts of drug sales to buy nice houses and nice cars. So there's a lot of benefits for the people recruiting as well. But I just wanted to highlight that it's not, a selfless kind of exploration of providing people with the community identity and purpose. Let's see. Okay, so Parents for Peace is here to help. So while I can't promise you that we'll fix this whole issue, I can talk about some of the ways that we try to combat this. So we have 4 core programs. I'm really going to just be touching on the helpline right now because I think that'll be the most helpful for you. But our core programs include a toll-free helpline that anyone can call at any time, a support network for families, the trauma recovery program, which is something we're currently developing actually with Chris Buckley, all about kind of processing trauma, similar to like a 12-step program for trauma. And then research and development of standard operating procedures. So for this, we're working with the Harvard School of Public Health, the Georgia State University, University of Chicago, and other partners to develop more of the research on this because there's so much we don't know. I've been in this field for a little while, and it seems that every time you think you have it figured out, extremist recruiters got better, or things changed, or there's another social media platform like TikTok that I'm just trying to run after. So the model, the Parents for Peace model. So within the helpline, we have the initial call. Sometimes the initial call turns into an intake if the person has time. And if we have the staff for it, then we have the intervention and follow-up. For intervention, we provide 2 types of intervention, indirect and direct intervention. So let's say I have a child who I'm concerned about and I call. I would start having weekly sessions with the intervention team. That would be an indirect intervention because they're trying to use me to get to my child. And then some people do call. We have some self-referrals that are like, I'm really angry and I want to hurt people and I don't know what to do. And that would be more of the direct intervention. Most of our work is indirect intervention, but we do have a handful of cases of direct intervention. So the helpline. So who calls? Intimate bystanders is kind of the new term these days, which is families, friends, parents, significant others. We have children that call on their parents. We have obviously parents that call on their children. We have husbands that call on their wives and vice versa. So it's really kind of a whole entire community approach. We also have had some schools and law enforcement also contact us worried about someone in their classes. So we really kind of get everybody. A lot of the questions, at least from parents, who radicalized my child, who paid for it, why did my child fall for it? The question I didn't necessarily want to put on here, but I did want to discuss is, was it my fault? Like, what could I have done? And a lot of times, it's not always the parent's fault, right? We've seen really great examples of loving, compassionate, super involved parents, and the child wants to look for meaning and finds that somewhere else. So, I just wanted to mention that. So we launched the helpline in 2017 and have developed and continue to develop this with global experts. And this is our phone number, which I can also send out to you after. Let's see, intake. So let's say someone calls, they get our intake. person, basically, and we gather as much information as possible about the individual they're concerned about, and we acknowledge the complexity of the caller situation. I want to really stress the range of calls we get. So we get ones that, oh, my child is spending more time online and I'm a little worried, to I found 16 guns under my kid's bed and I don't know what to do. So those are kind of the two polar opposites, but those are the calls we deal with. For the calls with 16 guns, we have recommended they hang up and dial 911 immediately because we need to kind of get rid of the threat of violence, and then we can start working on the ideology. But I say this to let you know that if you interact with someone that's worried about this and doesn't want to call the police, I recommend they call us so that we can help them navigate it. Right. So, and then we can be another force that, emails them and say, hey, I strongly recommend you reach out to law enforcement. Here's why. And being a non-judgmental place for them to process a lot of this. A lot of the intake by saying, like, what was your kid like before this, makes them feel understood, secure, and it already starts helping us establish a trusting relationship. After the intake process, that we schedule weekly intervention calls with the caller and our intervention team. So the next step is the intervention. So you take the exit peer specialist, which I'll remind you has some psychological background. Again, they are not practicing psychologists, but they have some education in psychology, and the exit peer specialists who have lived recovery experience. And we pair them together to meet with the caller every single week. On these calls, the first step, you educate the caller. So a lot of that is, what is violent extremism? What is the radicalization process? What are the different vulnerabilities? And then from there, once they're a little bit more educated, we work on the development of a toolbox, how to help them deal with hateful language and behavior. A lot of this, I don't know how many of you have interacted with toddlers. I nannied for a while. Toddlers can be really mean sometimes. But the nice thing about kind of thinking about this way is when a toddler is hangry or angry, they say a lot of hurtful things. It's similar with this kind of hateful speech that's just thrown in all the time. And when parents or individuals close to this person try to, say, well, you're an idiot for thinking that way, or that's horrible, why would you say that? There's something wrong with you. All that does is it rips further into the wound that's right under all that extremist language. So what we're teaching people in the toolbox is, think of the hate speech as a foreign language. Completely ignore it. And this way, if someone says, the way I think about it is, I remember nannying for a little boy, and I said, do you want, it's breakfast, do you want eggs or do you want yogurt? And he's like, I hate you. I'm like, cool, so eggs or yogurt? And it's very similar in this, obviously very, very different, but similar in the sense that when people are using hateful language, we're telling the people on the helpline, like, don't address it. If someone says something really hateful and anti-Semitic, you say, okay, did you want to go to this baseball game? Did you want to do this? Do you want to, and you work on just consistently building the relationship with the person so that they then have a support system to go to when they want to leave the extremist ideology. And what we've seen too is by building up the support system and getting good relationships around that person, the hate speech just wanes over time because it doesn't need to cover and act as a barrier to protect them from anything, because you're starting to address the reasons that they originally wanted to go into this ideology. Okay, perfect. Post-intervention follow-up. I thought this is a very cute email picture for follow-up because a lot of them were much more urgent looking, but I hope that made all of your days as well. So as far as the intervention goes, our interventions vary. I'm thinking of one family we've met with every week for 3 years, and we've met with the individual of concern and his parents every single week. So some of these things take time, and just like success in careers, it's not always like an upward stream of everything's going well. Sometimes it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, and it's very fluid. A lot of times too, everything's going really well. Then 6 months later, we get a call and someone's like, yeah, I think we're going backwards a little bit. Can we start sessions again? And that's something that we offer as well, trying to be as much of an open door as possible for people. And the last kind of point is, how can we work together to create a whole society approach to combating radicalization, violence, and extremism? So in this section, I'm going to talk about the role of parents, the role of mental health practitioners, and the role of schools. This is in no way to blame anyone. I just want to start there, but just talk about how we can all work together and how certain people are critical positions where they get to have access to people who might be radicalized or vulnerable to radicalization, and how we can all work together. So parents. So in most cases, parents are the closest link to the individual of concern, especially if they're younger, they tend to live with you. So that's already one sense. They raise the subject and child is a formative period for someone's brain development in general. So I'm going to give you an example. So we had in California, we had a Parents for Peace participant who's 20 years old, who currently lives at home with his mother, father, and brother. He currently holds far-right ideologies and beliefs, which have evolved since at least the age of 16. So as he is now 20, this is about 4 years of radicalization. Mental health wise, he openly suffers from anxiety and depression. The mother believes that him and his father have undiagnosed ASD or autism spectrum disorder. He also believes that he himself has ADHD, and he's gone to the emergency room 5 times in the last year for panic attacks. His current belief system, so he identifies as, quote, conservative. He's a strong supporter of the America First Party, anti-LGBTQIA+, misogynistic or incel beliefs, state that women cannot understand anything he ever goes through, has a lot of kind of white supremacy, anti-Semitic, anti-vaccine leanings. And the family dynamic. So prior to the intervention, he shared the strongest connection with his mother, regardless of the incel beliefs. He didn't have a good relationship with his father and said it felt very formal and businesslike. The mother and father have become emotionally detached from one another, so they're not really a united front. And the father tends to lash out at the mother for conversing with her son about his beliefs and places blame on her for the son's behavior. So because you talk about it, it is now your fault. Now, post-intervention, the subject is now more connected with his mother and learning love languages, but consistently criticizes the mother about why she is, oh, sorry, my screen froze for 1 second, criticizes his mother for not fully understanding the ideology. And the father addressed his approach to his son's beliefs, and a smaller amount of progress has been made in mending that relationship. The parents have begun to find new ways to connect, and the mother and father have started to work together more on holding their son responsible for his behavior. So some of this is just kind of bringing the parents together to be a more united front and working to better the relationships with the son. So that's kind of one outcome that we're looking for, is to build up that family system as much as possible. For mental health practitioners, I feel like in your line of work, this must happen all the time. We wish we could just take a bunch of really amazing mental health clinicians and clone them 1.5 billion times so that everyone has enough. So we finally have enough in the country for therapists, especially in the post-COVID era. There's just a lot more mental health issues we're seeing. So mental health practitioners in our space act as an additional support network outside of the family. They provide a case-based knowledge and experience of the individual and ensure consistent following during months and years. And they're a trusted actor in society, which can facilitate discussion. So part of our intake process is asking, does this person have a therapist? Do they have a pediatrician or doctor they enjoy working with? And working on signing releases so that we can talk to that person to be as much of a united and holistic front as possible. I'll give you one example. This is a subject who's 20 years old, was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, who got involved in an ISIS ideology. So he was diagnosed with high functioning ASD and attended a school specifically for children with disabilities. He suffers from PTSD, secondary PTSD from watching violent ISIS propaganda. So that's another form of PTSD, has anger management and depressive episodes, has had multiple psych evaluations from various institutions, and has been through inpatient treatment and suffers from incredibly low self-esteem. He converted to Islam when he gained a sense of acceptance, where he became self-radicalized and sympathetic to the Islamic State and jihadist ideology. He possesses a journal of Islamist material. Journals and articles are pretty common. Al-Qaeda used to have one called Inspire magazine that was weirdly very well produced. Through additional support, he shifted his views to reflect an anti-Islamic view, had a little while where he switched to a white nationalist ideology and then kind of back. This switching, also known as salad-bar-terrorism, is actually rather, like, not super common, but definitely not unheard of. And with P4P intervention, We've talked consistently with his therapist to educate them on extremism, the radicalization process, and this has led the subject to connect well with the 2 therapists he was working for, and that has really influenced his progress. So even if we're not in the room, we can kind of educate the mental health practitioners to say, I know this is super scary. These are things you have to look for, and this is how we can help. And it's important to note that the mother believes that without this therapist and our help, her son, she'd not be able to control him. And then schools. So this is actually a Massachusetts example, hitting, as we talked about, a little closer to home. So we dealt with a subject who was a senior in high school in the greater Boston area. A year ago, he started spending a lot of time on YouTube and Reddit, following white supremacy channels. And last year, his school had him participate in a restorative justice circle after he made racist and homophobic comments at school. So mental health, history of anxiety, diagnosed with ADHD, and has been in and out of therapy his entire life. And his sister recently tried to take her own life. The personal beliefs: anti-Semitic, homophobic, anti-women discourse, anti-LGBTQ, and racist comments to classmates. Unfortunately, those tend to be put well together, or tend to run together. After his derogatory and offensive comments at the school put him on an emergency removal until further evaluation, with desire to set up additional restorative justice circle. And this led him to feel ganged up against and alienated further, which had him dive further into the ideology. And this was dangerous because further alienation can lead to further radicalization. And the school then interviewed him and had a third party review everything and issued recommendations. His psychiatrist wrote a letter about how he presents, and the letter, to be honest, was a little defensive and not trying to punish him, but protect him, which I think, we can have more of a discourse in a second about how do you hold people accountable, right? Which was kind of the beginning of this conversation. You want to hold people accountable and know to the families of the person you were talking about that justice was served. Now, the role of P4P in this. So after exchanging with the mother of the individual, we highly recommended she reach out to the school to explain why their option was not working for him and really work with the school as much as possible. And the school agreed to not use kind of the justice circle to make him feel more ganged up on, but how to understand how they could intervene and how they could work with him. And it turns out the student was being pretty severely bullied, and kind of working to protect that student and then also deal with some of the underlying issues. So I think, sorry if that was really fast. I tend to talk a little faster when I'm nervous. So let me just, I can stop screen sharing. Oh, I have one thing in the chat. I can send out the slides to Antonia. Antonia, if you'd like to send those out, that would be fantastic. So thank you, Olga, for that question. But I'm sorry, that was a lot of information. I'm going to put my email down in the chat here. I realized I didn't have it on the slide. If anyone wants to kind of email me, I'm always down to talk more about this. I tried to give you as much of a broad picture as possible, but I really want to say I appreciate all the amazing work that all of you do. And I think you all have really, really difficult jobs. I think at Parents for Peace, we're just trying to build empathy for this population enough to bring them back into society. And maybe empathy isn't necessarily the best word, but really humanization. So we want to humanize these people as much as possible so that we can bring them back into school, back into society. So just, I'm going to be answering some questions. So do you do trainings in the schools? Not as of now. We've been trying to reach out to a lot of schools. I think that's something we're very interested in. So if anyone is interested or wants to even start conversations with schools, please feel free to email me, and we can start seeing what that would look like. We're currently developing a training for Boston EMS, so we're trying to work with them on this. And obviously, it would not be the same training, but we could kind of show that template once we have it, and then see how we could adapt that best to schools. So, will it be appropriate for school staff to call you with concerns over a student? Should we suggest parents reach out to you? So it's kind of a whatever you want to do situation, Olga. So you can call and you can encourage people in your staff to call and say, hey, I'm worried about a student. Is there anything I should do? Which then, we can have that conversation of like, you might want to might need more intervention as far as law enforcement intervention for certain things versus, having the parents reach out. And then we can also talk about potential strategies on sending information to the parents. I can imagine parents being a little defensive about this. So I wouldn't want to put you in a position. So I think instead of handing our information over to parents, it might be better to call us and then we can try to figure out a strategy around that. I just wouldn't want to put anyone in that position to deal with any backlash from handing a flyer with Parents for Peace. We try to make it as empathetic as possible. So, okay. Also, Lisa, that is great. I actually live in the Medford area. Well, I live in Stoneham now, but I moved from Melrose. So, Antonia, did you have a question? Okay.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about, I'm assuming the beginning of the process is a consent that the parent is letting you work with the kids or even with the young adult. Does sometimes that consent go away when it's a little more challenging, or how do you make sure that that consistency and the family involvement is always at a level that you're going to see some type of transformation?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we do have people sign a consent form, and because we're not providing therapy, we don't have the same HIPAA protections. So we would have to, like, if we were subpoenaed, would have to turn over some records, right? So we make that really clear in our like disclosure forms. The other thing is with the consent. So while we keep everything private and confidential, we do say that confidentiality is like must be broken by our organization if there's a threat to an individual or others. So if there's any threat, we work to encourage the parents to call law enforcement, but have said, if you don't call, we will be calling, because we, one, it's a huge liability, and two, we don't want anyone to get hurt. But we really try to make it as led from the parents as possible so that they're in the driver's seat. And we also have contacts at the FBI, DHS, and all these other government agencies that we've then referred people to, because calling the FBI can be really scary, but calling, if we say, hey, we have a contact who understands the work we do, why don't you call them? It's automatically a little less scary. There's a big study that I can send around too that was interesting. It was part of it's National Institute of Justice funding, but I think it was people out of University of UCLA, I think, but they interviewed a bunch of parents and said, like, would you report your kid to law enforcement in cases of extremism? And they were like, I don't know. I'm afraid that person might try to, my child might try to hurt me. That might escalate their plans. And it was also like, do I call them on an emergency line? Do I call 911? Can I call them if nothing has happened yet? Do I have to wait till someone's been hurt? So there's really no clarity around that. So that's just kind of one thing I can send around, but we're hoping to kind of bring a little bit more clarity to that. Melvin, did you have a question?
Yeah, just quickly, do you have statistical data to show a success rate? And in that breakdown, do you show specific categories that you find higher incidence level, for example, in say homophobia versus racist, misogynic kind of leanings? I mean, do you have like a breakdown of where you're finding your most consistent problem in dealing with students?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really all over the map. One thing I will say is this field is still, it's crazy to say the field is new, especially, terrorism has always been a problem, especially after 9/11, but a lot of this like extremism as we see it now is relatively new and understudied. So I can tell you a little bit more about our breakdown, but that's not going to be representative. So we're the only organization that really works predominantly with families. There's one other organization in the US that focuses only or predominantly with individuals of concern calling themselves. Tends to be an older population, and they only focus on white nationalists. And we are the only two organizations in the US who are currently really doing the intervention space work. There are a couple smaller ones, but we are more of the larger ones. And I think we have at this point 7 employees. So we're rather small. But to your point about statistics, as far as success rate, this is something we've been having a lot of conversations with, including other organizations in Europe and with the Department of Homeland Security. There's no risk assessment, case assessment, or radicalization assessment tool that has been validated. There are some in use, but none of them have been validated, and studies have not been incredibly favorable to them. So what we're trying to do internally is build our own case assessment of like, okay, this is usually what happens when things look better, and trying to assess it on there. But I think the success rate can be difficult, especially where I don't want to equate this necessarily to addiction, But people can be doing really well and then have more trauma that backs them back into this. And we've talked about this, like if someone presents and is completely fine, I'd be afraid to give my stamp of de-radicalization approval, because who knows what's going to happen in 20 years. So I think when we talk about success stories, it's harder from a research kind of perspective. But we've helped, over 100 families since 2017. And we've been taking kind of more detailed records in the past 2 years. So currently we have 35 cases, and the cases sometimes include kind of 2 intervention sessions per week with the parents and the individual. Some are on an every other week classification, and it really depends. As things get better, sometimes we stagger the sessions to see if they need us less, and sometimes things get worse and we're like, well, we're back to weekly then, and kind of go from there. But that was a really great point. And I'm just going to read out Fran's question here. So you are not mandated reporters, but do you have that safety out that empowers you to always contact law enforcement yourself if you find it necessary? So this is something we're actually working with our own attorneys with, because we're not, because we're not social workers or anything, we don't have that code of ethics that mandates that we contact law enforcement, but we should contact law enforcement. So we're currently kind of getting our list of risk factors, anything involving violence. And we've also tried to talk about how can we involve law enforcement potentially a little earlier. So if we see something getting worse, empowering the families to do that. So that's definitely something we're in conversation about, or we're talking within ourselves on how to make it a little bit more formalized and robust. I think it reminds me a slightly, obviously different spectrum, but where social workers are only licensed per state, you can't have social workers that are living in Massachusetts and then all of a sudden you get a helpline call from someone in Texas. But Texas might not have the resources to help that one person who really needs help. So I think as these regulations change, I think our industry is going to change, and mandating reporting will become a little bit easier, and there'll be a little bit more easy steps. But I think we're trying to operate in a little bit of a gray area where people are calling us from Canada and Texas and California and Idaho, and they're crying and hysterical and scared. So it's like, okay, well, what can we do right now? And what is out of our control and above our limit? And a lot of that too is also working, as I mentioned earlier, with mental health practitioners. So, okay, if this person can be seeing someone physically in person once a week and then see us once every other week, or us also once a week, that's a really good balance, because then we can communicate with that person, with that therapist, and say, hey, we're seeing some of these signs. Do you think law enforcement intervention is a good idea? And we have recommended some law enforcement intervention, or more like inpatient care. And the therapist or psychiatrist on that case was like, I don't think that's necessary. And the parents agree with me. So that's where it can be a little bit more difficult. But especially with cases of any acquisitions of weapons or trying to build weapons or something, we're immediately pushing people to law enforcement.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up, please? It seems like I can see how your goal is to kind of keep rapport and build rapport by working with families and having the families report to law enforcement or schools or whoever if necessary. The difficulty I have with that is just kind of human nature. You may have a conversation with them wanting them to convey this amount of information. They all agree it's a problem, and you might only get a small subset of that conveyed to law enforcement or the school if you leave it entirely up to the family member to make that call. So, I think that's a tension that might be there.
Well, and sometimes the conversations we often have in our team is, I'd love to call up the school and tell them what's happening. But then if I break the parents' trust and then they don't trust in us or anyone else, the problem's sure to get much worse. Because now they don't even have us to talk to. And there's already so much shame and guilt, and they're already hiding it from their neighbors. So kind of to your point, it is, something that we're definitely working on. How are we able to report and encourage people to report? But I also think this is a harsher way of saying this, but no one wants their kid to be on the news for harming people. So I think that even if their information is incomplete, for the times that we've told parents to call law enforcement, they have. So we've been very lucky with the people. There was one case, they were incredibly worried about their son. We told them to call law enforcement and they said, okay, we'll do it first thing tomorrow morning. And the FBI arrested their son that night. So like, well, clearly the FBI is doing a very, very good job. But we're trying to partner with as many people as we can. And again, we tell them like, if you don't, we will be required to also do that because we don't want anyone else to get hurt. I mean, legally, the worst thing for us is them saying, well, we also worked with Parents for Peace and they said our kid was fine. You're like, whoa, we did not. But thank you, friend. That was a really, really great point. Oh, yes.
Diana, what about, the parents who make that report? I can just imagine well, I really can't, so awful. The idea of having to actually make that report and tell people about that. Do you offer like any separate services just for those parents dealing with whatever's going on or point them in a different direction?
Yeah, so some of that is the intervention. So I'm thinking of one that had a lot of hate speech issues and was sending out flyers, like white nationalist flyers at school. And we encouraged the parent to reach out to the school. And she did, and she had a meeting with the school officials and she's like, here's the deal. This is what's going on. These are the mental health issues involved here. And she's like, I see myself as an advocate for my son at school, but I have to get the school on board. So it was us kind of trying to channel a lot of that anxiety into how to like make her work with the school as much as possible. She was luckier because I think they were more open to it, where I don't know if every school would be, but trying to encourage them as much as possible to work with the existing system, partially because we can't be everywhere.
What about for the parents though? I mean, for dealing with their own guilt or upset or, it's got to be traumatic for them, whatever they've been living through, and then actually making that call.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of one case where the justice system got involved and they wanted to do renovations on their house and they had saved all this money and they were so excited, and that renovation budget had to be used for legal fees. Like that's, you can see why there would be a lot of anger and resentment. And then guilt for feeling that anger and resentment. Like that's really complicated. So a lot of our intervention sessions with them is getting them on the same page and telling their son like, hey, like, I understand you're better now, but like, this is how it impacted us. And I need you to see that. And a lot of times, to be honest I'm thinking of a case of someone who is part of a white nationalist ideology and very like America First ideology. Once the parents started saying like, this is how it's affecting me, this is how it's affecting your brother, this is what we're dealing with, like the individual, especially a lot of teenagers, like they're only seeing their own role in it. They're like, well, this is how it benefits me, this is how it might hurt me. And they're not able to think 50 years in advance. So everything's immediate. But hearing the dad say, hey, like, I think I might lose my job. And hey, this is happening to your brother, like your brother's getting bullied. Like some of this started to click in and it was easier for them to kind of back up from the ideology a little bit, realizing that it was also having harmful effects on people that they really cared about and loved. But I think when it comes to reporting things to police, I mean, I'm thinking of the extreme example, when you have 16 guns or you find that your child is trying to make guns from, objects at a hardware store, I think you're just so worried you're going to end up on the news that we're like, be as transparent as you can be. We try to talk about the police and law enforcement in general as if they can stop this, your child's going to be so much better off. You don't want them executing this because then everything is going to get worse. So if police are here to prevent as much as possible, and trying to restore as much faith in the police as possible.
Diane, do you see many, I see that there's a few that have, been through the process, have recovered and are now working for you. Do you see others coming to you that have gone through that process, to whether they volunteer or you hire?
Yeah, so it's really exciting. So we're working with Georgia State University to do a peer support training. So these are people who have been radicalized, have a lived recovery experience, and we're starting to do training we're starting to build the training so that they can go through the peer support and then work in this space, including for us, which is nice partially because there's a lot of people with lived experience with white nationalist ideologies and Islamist ideologies, there's far less women in this space. You know, we have some people in our caseload that self-identify as Antifa and things like that. There's just less in those kinds of spaces. So we're hoping that with the peer support training, we can train more people with those lived experiences to make it easier for us and have them intervene in cases that we have. I'm sorry if this was a heavy topic on Thursday, but again, I'm trying to make it as fun as possible. But I mean, I appreciate you all taking the time, and please feel free to connect with me. I like to nerd out about this stuff, but also as much empathy as we can bring to victims of radicalization and people who are radicalized, and as much help as we can give these families so that there's less shame and less guilt, so they can seek help earlier. And that's before people get hurt. I feel like the better off we all are, especially where, you know, I also live in Middlesex County. So the safer we can make it for all of us, for my family and yours, I'm happier. So.
Any last questions, comments?
I have one. It's Catherine.
Catherine?
Just wondering if you work with like the Department of Youth Services or others, just, you know, with your knowledge about these kinds of issues, because I'm wondering if, you know, post-police intervention, what happens?
Yeah, a lot of it, we haven't, but we're very interested in kind of engaging. A lot of the work that we've done as far as kind of post-radicalization, we do a good amount of work in federal prisons. So working with people who have been charged and convicted with material support charges and are now facing sentences, and working with them so that when they get out, they're going to have a big issue kind of coming out. So how can we deal with the ideology so that just the regular exit and reintegration from prison is one of the major things they're working with instead of the true ideology. But we haven't done as much with the student population, but it's definitely something we're trying to break more into. So that's a fantastic idea. And if you have any connections, not to throw you on the spot, Catherine, but any ideas or connections, feel free to kind of email me. We're in a big period of expansion, which is exciting. We're trying to bring on 2 more interventionists and kind of beef up our helpline. So as we can do this, some of our current staff will have a little bit more capacity to kind of develop trainings and work with other organizations. And the executive director and myself are both live in this area. So the more we can build up in Mass, we wanted to try to make Mass a leader in this space where we can make New York jealous and all these other places jealous, because we have a really great way of handling this.
All right. Diana, thank you. This was great. And we will share the information and share the slides, and people obviously have other questions, they can reach out to you, but I so appreciate you doing this.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
All right. Anybody have anything else, or announcements or programs or things that people are working on? And I remind everybody, if you have ideas of things that are happening or things that you'd like to learn more about, please reach out to Antonia. We'll work at getting those types of speakers for the future programs. We want to make this be as responsive to your needs as we can. And if we have nothing else, I thank you again for being here, and we will see you June 8th at 10 o'clock. Thank you, Mel. That was great. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Enjoy the beautiful weather.